Hello and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Colm Lacey.
Hi Colin, how are you?
Very well, thanks Tom. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for having me here in this absolutely amazing, light, tall office that you've got, surrounded by images of Soft City you were just telling me.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Bush Wagner. He's a Norwegian artist, and he did a graphic novel called Soft Cities, and there's also a book by Jonathan Raban called Soft Cities from the 70s, both of which sort of imagine urban utopias or dystopias. So I thought it was an interesting influence for the name of the company.
Interesting, yeah. And so, urban utopias and dystopias. I'm sure we could have a long conversation about that in a sec. But maybe before we dive in, why don't you just give a bit of an introduction to yourself and what you're up to now?
So I'm Colm Lacey. I'm founder and managing director of Soft Cities. Also group director of capital projects for New City College, which is where we are today. And I also, in my spare time, chair the board of London CLT, which is a community-led housing organisation. So all of those things keep me very busy. I guess the thing that I'm spending most of my time on at the moment actually is building new education buildings for New City College, which is fascinating and great and a wonderful sector to work in. Having moved out of housing development post Brick by Brick, did a lot of housing development prior to this. Firstly with Brick by Brick and then with various local authorities on the development and regeneration housing side of local authorities over the last 20 years or so. So it's a really interesting time. It's nice to be working in education now, particularly while residential is quite quiet, although hopefully there's some changes in that regard coming up soon. And also really good to get to know a different sector, you know, the demands, I guess, and the needs and the spatial requirements and obligations and creative capacity and a whole new set of stakeholders in the students that we work with and the staff that we work with here. So it's been a really interesting change for me.
Yeah, no, fascinating. And so what does soft cities mean? What makes a city soft?
Well, on the soft cities side, I mean, the name itself, soft cities, is, I guess, the soft element of a city is everything that's not a building or a piece of built form. So it's the activities that go on in the city or the stakeholders that use the city, day and nighttime users, the energy, the relationships, the connections, the feelings that go on in a cityscape, as opposed to the buildings necessarily themselves. Obviously, both are inextricably linked in any good city. The practice itself is really a development management and urban advisory practice, but I guess the reason for the name is that I think the driving influence in all of that should be in creating spaces for those soft elements to flourish. I mean, buildings are very important and architecture is very important. Urban design and layout is extremely important, but ultimately we shouldn't forget, I think, the reason we're creating any of this is to try and enable and encourage a flourishing city and an interesting city. So those soft elements are really important, even if you're not necessarily working directly with them every day, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, we're operating in similar spaces always, a lot of overlap, you know, in our conversations historically and kind of a lot of shared interest and values there around that. And how have you kind of come to that personally in terms of your attitude towards your work and why this sort of aspect of sort of soft cities and soft city making is something that personally resonates for you?
Well, I feel like I've spent a lot of time as a client. You know, I think probably if the short sort of dinner party version of what I do is to be a professional client, and that is to represent a whole disparate set of disciplines and needs and wants and stakeholders in any professional discussion with people who do things in a built environment. So that's a really important role. I think it's a particularly important role in the public sector. It was one that I always felt the obligation of, and I always felt the importance of in the public sector, was how to be the best client I could be, how to get the most out of any project I could, how to get the most efficient project or spend public sector money wisely. And kind of in thinking about that, there's a lot of different factors at play. There's a lot of different priorities at play. And ultimately, it was, I guess, a bit of shorthand, really, to come to the realization that the ultimate client should be the people who ultimately use the spaces that you're creating, the people who ultimately live there. A lot of my career I've been building housing, and that's quite easy because, you're creating a space for somebody to live in, you're creating a domestic space, you're creating the spaces around that building, you're doing some placemaking, you're knitting that into an existing context. There's some quite technical elements to thinking about how that works, the domestic quality and environment, the external quality environment, the city itself, planning policies, everything else. Well, when it's not necessarily a straightforward residential development, or you're designing for particular cohorts, or you're trying to encourage a mix of uses, which might not be the normal mix of uses in any scheme, or particularly now when not too many mixes of things are particularly viable, then you have to think a little bit outside the box. I find that a really useful bit of shorthand to think, the person I'm designing for, or the person I'm clienting for, is the people who ultimately use this space. And it works for public spaces, it works for major infrastructure projects, it works for residential projects, it works for education projects that I'm delivering now, is, to always think about the kind of comfort and interest and energy and needs, I guess, of the people that you're clienting for. So it's really important, and it's shorthand's probably the wrong word. It's kind of the guiding principle behind most of the jobs that I've had and continue to have to this day, is to think about who'll ultimately use the spaces.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, very much comes across in all of the entities that you've been involved in, your passion. And is that something you can track back to a point in your life where you feel like, where some of those values come from for you, as on a personal level, why you want to, spend your time in, obviously, development and urbanism, which is clearly a passion, but doing it for that client type that you're talking about?
I think it is. I think it's in my nature to, I guess, want to root for the underdog a little bit and want to create spaces for people who wouldn't ordinarily have the power in any in any kind of economic dynamic like that. That's not to say, I came at this with a bleeding heart and a spirit of activism. I didn't. I fell into working in regeneration and housing, and come out of other more creative things like graphic design and photography. I did a little bit of. I did some magazine production and event management and all sorts of different things before I started in regeneration per se. But once I did, I think, I brought. I'm from North Dublin, and in Dublin, which isn't the nicest part of Dublin. And people there have to kind of fight for what they have, and fight to keep what they've already got. And I think it's necessary to bring a little bit of yourself into any job that you do. So what I brought with me, I think, was a sense of that spirit of North Dublin into my first regeneration roles over here. Obviously, there's a lot of synergy and overlap between some of the communities that we were working for in regeneration schemes and some of the estates I was working on with where I come from myself. So I always felt kind of a kinship, I guess, with the people I was delivering for, rather than necessarily some of the developers I was working with. So yes, I think that's always been a guiding principle. I think as I've got older and more experienced in this, it's I think the trick of this, or doing it well, is to try to encourage that kinship in everybody that's working on the project. It's easy to say that there's a good side and a bad side to any deal or relationship or any regeneration story. Or developers aren't bad and public sector is good, because it's not the way. There's a mixture, and all of those parties do good and bad things and have good and bad intentions in any scheme that's delivered. So I think if you can find a middle way through, a consistent middle way through, which really focuses on the good that's going to come from any project, or the journey. I guess nowadays it's called social value, isn't it? But back then it was really just trying to find the heart and the core and the truth of any project that you're trying to deliver. I I think that's what's really important to focus on. So that hasn't changed from when I was a teenager in Dublin to whatever age I am now. I'm not willing to divulge that. So yeah, I think it's a guiding principle. Now, I think working in the public sector and in the third sector and in affordable housing and working with community-led housing now, for example, it's a lot easier to keep that spirit with you. You know, you're not necessarily driven by shareholders' demands that haven't worked for in the private sector or for a big house builder or something like that, where perhaps trying to keep that is a slightly more difficult challenge than in the public sector, where a lot of the people you're working with and the entities that you're working for are at least officially there to try to promote social values. So I have found it quite easy to keep that spirit alive in my career today, whereas others might struggle a little bit more. But I do think it's important, and it's I guess at the core, I believe what's really important is to bring your own ethics into whatever job you're doing, and to ensure that those ethics are kind of completely represented in everything that you do on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, as an outsider, I think that really comes across in the conversations we've had together, and the roles you've taken up, and the work you've done. And how do you see that throughout your career, of that kind of mission, if we call it that, you know, those kind of set of values, and then how you actually go about delivering projects, you know, whether it's large portfolios of housing or the education that you have now, because, you know, the experience working in the public sector, you know, actually getting things done, getting things built, getting initiatives to flourish is not easy to do, is it?
No, it's not. I think, well, we talked already about having in mind on the ultimate client, so having in mind on ultimately who's going to use your scheme is a helpful guiding principle. I think avoiding any easy convention. I think in property development, there's a lot of things that everybody takes for granted, or everybody assumes from the off. You know, that design will progress through the REBA stages, and it should be left to just the architects involved in a scheme. Shouldn't really be questioned too much. You know, the focus of the development should be to finish stage one, and then make sure you've still got your money in order, and then go on to stage two and finish that and start the process of talking to planning or whatever it might be, without any level of kind of lifting the cover on that whole process and trying to pick it apart a little bit and understand whether you can make it better anywhere along the way. And I think both as a sort of true public sector client through a lot of the work I did with local authorities, or as an out-and-out developer, as we did with Brick by Brick, I found that there was real value actually in starting to pick all of that apart, you know, rather than looking at the most obvious scheme that you might put on a site, to look at 6 or 7 others, or rather than trying to maximize the amount of numbers on one site, maybe look at a couple of sites together and see which one can deliver more capacity and which one might deliver more quality in a different way. So there's real value to be had, I think, in sort of discarding the conventional rules, I guess, of appraisal or, you know, site appraisal or analysis, and sort of poking at the edges of that through every stage from the very beginning in any project to see whether you can make it better. I think in my roles in local authorities where they were analysing other people's schemes, I always felt there was a little bit of built-in failure into that process. You know, we kind of assume as a public sector client that you've probably been taken for a ride a little bit, or assume that, you know, they probably can deliver more affordable housing, but we better not ask for it, because if we do, that might, you know, kill the whole thing off. And that's a really imperfect conversation, I think, you know, for both parties, because one thinks, you know, well, we'll see how far we can get with only offering whatever it is, 15% affordable housing, and the others sort of, we don't want to push them too hard. And nowhere along the way is there any real conversation about what is the best scheme that we can deliver together here. So, you know, I didn't like that as a process. I felt like it wasn't the most rewarding way to deliver development. So I think the way I tried to deal with that in my own roles was to work together with that developer to really open up the bonnet of the scheme itself. You know, let's talk to them about every single figure in their financial appraisal, talk to them about what their assumptions are, look at other schemes they might have developed and see where that figure fits in there, and why is it more here and why is it less there. Look at land value and examine different ways that land value could be paid. What happens if we defer it? What happens if we convert it into this way, that way? All with a view to seeing whether it can improve the ultimate scheme that you're delivering. And I improve, usually by my perspective, that meant either delivering more affordable housing or a better scheme, a better quality scheme, or more amenity space or social value in whatever way it was defined in that scheme. When we then had Brick by Brick, which was a development company in which we were able to control a lot more of those processes, that became really important because ultimately we were working on a set of suburban sites which were not viable by any stretch of the imagination, especially nowadays. They wouldn't be considered to be viable. So it needed a huge amount of work to actually get schemes that could actually be delivered on those sites together. It needed a huge amount of goodwill from all of the people who were involved in that program, the architects and engineers and everybody else, to constantly rework these schemes to try to get them to a point of viability, or to try and get a batch of schemes to a point of viability where some would be better than others in order to kind of cross-subsidize each other. And it was a really collaborative process of lifting the bonnet or lifting the cover on all of those schemes and examining every single input into it. And that could range from anything from, what tenure are we delivering on a certain site, or what housing typology are we delivering. Maybe we focus on houses there because the market is slightly better for 3-bed houses, and maybe we focus on 1-bed units here. So that included all of our professional teams as well as the planning department and whatever we were working in. Or it might come down to very practical things like, why are we specifying these materials? Why am I paying 80 quid a square metre for an oak floor when I can go to, oak floor land and get the same floor for £40 a square metre? Why is it just because I'm a public sector client or just because I'm a developer, I'm paying twice as much? Let's not do that. Let's go and get it from there. Let's phone up those guys and see if they can deliver. Really fine-grained level examination of every single scheme to see how you can just deliver it a little bit better. And I think that's what clienting is, and I think that's how you can deliver more affordable housing and schemes, or that's how you can make some of these more difficult sites work. You have to put that level of investment into the process of clienting. It won't come easily to you. But equally, it's why I get a little bit frustrated when people say X schemes or X sites are not viable, or councils can't deliver housing of their own, or the skills are not there to be able to do that. Because I think they are there. It's perhaps just by any conventional measure of the development industry that those skills are there. And the flip side of that is that all of the skills are inherent in the development community rather than the public sector. So, let's give it to a developer to do because they're the experts. And of course, it's exactly the same level of limitation and capacity and capability in the private sector as there is in the public sectors. They don't have all the answers. They perhaps just have a slightly better infrastructure around them to try to get to where the answers might be. So that's a very long and convoluted way of saying, I think perhaps the way to actually ensure that that kind of character and ethic is delivered through any scheme is by really understanding your scheme and working it to death, treating every one like it's a very special scheme, as if it's something you're delivering for yourself or for your own family, to really get to the core of it and understand how you might be able to make it better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that care and that attention to detail at every stage of the project, I think is, as you say, is fundamental to creating good developments. And that model that you've just described there is not common, but in essence, that is something that every private company in theory could do. Kind of, be diligent, be caring. Were there any levers, should we say, like Brick by Brick or in some of the other public sector areas you've talked about that were being pulled or could be pulled that aren't available to the private sector? I'm thinking more around access to funding or to land or other things, because even doing everything you've just described, which I think is absolutely right, things still aren't really going to happen at the moment, for example, just because of where the market is. Whereas, if we think bigger, if we think about what the country probably needs and what maybe the direction of government is and some of those narratives, the why to is quite clear, but maybe the how to is maybe less so. Have you got any insights into that?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say it's not common, but I agree with you. It's not common in the development industry, but it's common in almost every other form of development. You know, it would be common if you're putting a new kitchen into your own house, or it would be common if you were doing your own self-build.
Yeah.
Or it would be common if any member of that development team, you know, the architect, the engineer, the developer themselves, they were doing their own self-build. They would examine their own scheme into this level of detail. But for some reason, when they come to a professional project of doing it, we all forget that we should and we don't bother to do it. And for sure, in public sector projects, you know, the big lever that's there, and it is a lever, is typically access to funding. You know, the funding is there, plus access to expertise. You know, you sit beside perhaps your planning colleagues, or you sit beside your building regulation colleagues or your housing colleagues, and you get much quicker access to information than, let's say, an ordinary developer would. But equally, that kind of lever can turn into quite a big hammer as well. You know, the politics of trying to deliver in the public sector is incredibly difficult, and ultimately did for things like brick by brick, which is a shame. So it's an interesting one to determine whether or not it's a sort of a help or hindrance to try to deliver in that context. I mean, your question about how can this current new government administration deliver more affordable homes, this is ultimately an economic exercise. You know, the delivery of housing, nobody's necessarily doing it for the good of their health. You know, builders, developers, even affordable housing providers are doing it because it makes economic sense to do so. At the moment, it doesn't make economic sense to do so. You know, it costs too much to build and there's not enough revenue coming in on the other side. So the only solution to that is for additional funding to come into the process. Now, whether that's additional revenue, you know, or grant comes in to each of the individual schemes, or whether it's through reduction in costs by different type of regulation, or assistance through the regulation process, or speeding up the regulation process, it's I think a bit of a moot point. I think ultimately, if you're going to deliver 1.5 million homes, it needs a just fundamentally different level of investment, a different amount of investment, a different type of investment, a different speed of investment, a different flexibility of investment to be able to do anything like that scale of change. You know, it means building the contractors who are actually going to build that. It means creating the development companies who are actually going to do those developments. It means refunding an entire affordable housing sector and housing association sector. It means floating all of the local authorities who are currently, you know, let's say drowning, or some of them bobbling along the bottom. You know, there's just so many huge macroeconomic things that need to happen for that to actually be able to be delivered. That I'm not saying it's impossible. I think it is possible, but we all need to factor in that this is probably the most transformative reinvestment in an entire sector that there's been ever, I would say, in that sector. And secondly, a scale of sort of public sector momentum that's post-war. You know, there's no other way we're going to do it. Now, we can improve our numbers slowly. We can do better than we've been doing, for sure. And I think the market will pick up, and there will be a certain amount of natural market improvement. There will be a certain amount of public sector-led improvement, and that will probably, you know, improve our numbers significantly. But nothing like the kind of scale that we're talking about. So either we assume that we have to do that, and the project becomes, what are these things that we have to actually do? And then how are we going to find the money to do those things? Or we assume that we're definitely going to fail. So let's just agree now we're going to fail and work out a more realistic target that we can hit. Personally, I think the former is the way forward. You know, let's not do this process, but whereby we all wait and see how much money government can actually release to do something, and then try and retrofit the strategy to that amount of money, because that's, I think, destined for failure. I think what we should be saying now is, these are all the things that actually need to change at this scale and at this pace. And how are we going to use private and public sector money to be able to fund that scale of change? I think that's the conversation we should be having. So it's a difficult one. I really welcome the intent, and it's actually just very refreshing and positive and it's a big weight off my shoulders actually just to hear some people talking positively about housing delivery or delivery in general, and for people who seem to be focused on people who are in genuine housing need, and the focus on affordable housing is really welcome, and the focus on social housing is really welcome. So the words are right. I think the initial approach is right, which is to try to fix policy a little bit, to try and, just unlock it a tiny bit. But the next stages are really, really important, and I don't think we should be under any illusion that this is anything but a once-in-a-generation investment from the public sector into a sector which is basically on its knees.
Yeah. No, well, that's super insightful, and I agree with you absolutely that it's really refreshing and needed to actually have this intent, which is, as you say, is the first step. But then, now it's really seeing where that goes, and so back to things that we can control / you are controlling in that sense in terms of your work day to day. And the space we're surrounded by and the work you're doing here. How does all of that sort of experience and that big picture translate into your day to day now and the work around education?
Well, we're looking at creating new education spaces here. So there's a really simple clienting function there, which is to create the best kind of education spaces we can. The most particularly interested at the moment in sort of the natural principles and biophilic principles of design, and particularly how they can be applied to education projects. I was speaking at a thing yesterday with Jerry Tate, who was talking about the work that Tate and Co, for example, are doing on that, which was really interesting to see. But those principles are really, really useful guiding principles actually for new education projects, access to light, visibility of open space from classrooms, fresh air, really simple things, but things that we've probably forgotten a little bit about in education design and education delivery over the years. Currently working in the further education sector. The New City College is a further education group, and there's a big problem with funding, as there is in many other sectors, but particularly for further education, both on the revenue side and on the capital side, there's a lack of funding to deliver the new facilities which are needed. So there's a lot of economic work necessary to try to free up enough funding for decent projects. There's some kind of finer grain elements of that, like further education projects pay VAT when they couldn't or shouldn't. So, I think whilst in the sector would like government to have a little look at that. So there's a couple of smaller levers that can be pulled along the way, but I guess the overarching principle of it is still to apply those same clienting principles to these projects as well, which is to focus on the people who ultimately operate from those spaces and then try to make the most of what are undoubtedly going to be limited means to deliver those types of projects. There are some larger projects which the group is also looking at, which focus on central London campuses and perhaps rethinking how those campuses are currently structured and remaster planning some of the campuses to focus on the opportunities that lie there, and also to improve the educational facilities which are already there. And they're really interesting projects on larger campuses to think about how we could do that. So it's interesting, but I guess in the last year or so, I've just been getting to know the sector a little bit more. It's a slightly different design community than the housing design community, slightly different contractor community as well. So getting to know the kind of people who do that, getting to see some projects which were I really liked actually, and which were done very well, I think. And then at the moment delivering a couple of sort of projects of around 5 million or so out in one of our Havering campuses, and another of around 15 million or so also out that direction. So decent sized capital projects where there's real potential to focus on the product itself that we're creating. Both of which are retrofit projects actually, and a lot of the central London work that we're looking at are also retrofit of existing campuses. So the group has got a really, really strong green strategy, really practical, focused on all the things that you would imagine around energy reduction and water reduction and waste reduction, but also on the nature of the spaces that we create, quality of spaces we create, how we can genuinely go for a retrofit first. So it's a really nice organization to be working with, and a good sort of client for me to be working with. Someone who's kind of, I guess, shares my aims and sort of vision around the right kind of projects. So really enjoying it at the moment. Actually, it's a nice change.
Yeah.
Breath of fresh air.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And what is the maybe not necessarily the future of the education sector, but I mean for the future of the organisation that you're looking at with respect to its built assets?
It's about improving the estate. There's a climate action roadmap for further education colleges, which a lot of colleges, including New City College, have signed up to. And that's effectively a journey from an emerging college, so that would be a set of colleges who haven't really thought about sustainability in any collective way before, through to established, I think, is the middle area, which is having much more sustainability principles and governance processes and structures and thinking embedded within the organisation, both within the teaching organisation and the governance structures, and also within the student body, to ultimately a leading group, which is ones that really pushing the edge and being innovators in terms of sustainability. So for New City College itself, it's keen to be a leading organisation by 2025. There are some very hard targets in that. For example, reduction in energy usage and water usage of 25% by 2025, which we're on track to achieve. Same with waste generation, a reduction of 25% by 2025, and ultimately leading to net zero by 2050, a nice, actually achievable target, which is nice to be working with things that we can actually do. So the way the estate works then is both within the kind of responsive repairs and maintenance of the estate, and in terms of any new estate that we might build, that it all adds into that overall strategy to lead towards us being a leading organisation. So it's about sustainability in its broadest sense, I guess, which is the right kind of buildings, which are maintainable, which are efficient, which are pleasant places to be in and teach from and to learn in. But the individual moves within that over the course of time, I think, will change. It all depends on numbers. College numbers change quite a lot. Some of our colleges are growing quite rapidly. That changes from time to time. We find in inner London areas, primary school numbers are changing quite a lot. So where we are in Hackley at the moment, primary school numbers are reducing. And that will have a knock-on effect in time, probably on college numbers. So things change and the demographics change and the focus of different campuses will change over time. But what remains constant is this push towards a much more modern, progressive and sustainable estate as a whole. And New City College has 12 or 13 campuses dotted around the south of the country. I think for the education sector as a whole, I guess the last big strategic change there's been with regards to new development in education was probably the Building Skills for the Future program, which is a long time ago now. The last anybody has heard about education estate is that it's falling down, rack and asbestos and whatever else, so both of those two things are quite negative really with regards to the improvement of the education estate. So I think what I would look for from the new administration is a much more positive story on education too. It is also an area of the state and capital that needs reinvestment and relooking at, and some additional investment and I guess measures to try to enable college groups like ours to invest in their own estate to make them better. Because it makes a big difference. I think one of the figures I saw yesterday was that the improvement in learning outcomes directly as a result of improved buildings is 16%. So people do 16% better learning from a better building than some of the educational facilities that we currently have. So it can have a significant impact, and I think it's important, and therefore should attract more investment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so just to finish then, Colin, I want to circle back on something you said at the introduction around your studies of, soft cities work and this kind of utopian, dystopian idea. And, everything that you've just described about your work and your ethos do you kind of have a feel for what, I don't necessarily want to say utopian, dystopian, because it's very polarized, but what a kind of good city, good place looks like in terms of, you know, the aspirations for the work that we're doing, and maybe counterpoints in that with, for example, the historic notion of soft cities and utopian, dystopian, and maybe where the similarities and differences are.
Oh, it's a big question.
Yeah, no, I like big questions.
I mean, I guess there's a very long answer and a shorter one. I guess the shorter answer for a good city is what we've been talking about for a long time. You know, genuinely mixed use, day and nighttime uses, intensity of interaction, intensity of creativity. You know, not necessarily mono-tenure or mono-use. Easy to get around. You know, variety of transport uses, air quality is decent, etc., etc. You know, we could go on forever about that. But I guess we've learned a lot in, let's pick London as a place. I think we've learned a lot about the city through COVID and through, I think we're actually at quite a momentous time in the property market itself at the moment. You know, things have been quiet for a long time. Things have been hit by repeated, really quite significant shocks to the economic system of property development, you know, public safety, mortgage rates, high inflation, you know, these are really seismic impacts actually. So things have been quiet for a long time, following a period where there was a really seismic impact, which was COVID, which saw, you know, drastic changes to the usage patterns within cities and people's attitude towards cities and people's sort of younger people's desire to live in the city or whatever else, followed by some quite knee-jerk policies. So policies, for example, around PD and policies around various ways that cities develop, you know, obviously these big seismic shifts in terms of retail patterns or whatever else. I think probably if there's one thing that I think is really important about all of that is that we shouldn't lose we shouldn't give away the space for the city to be able to reinvent itself. And I don't mean, I guess the obvious thing that people would think I'm talking about is PD. I'm not. I think PD delivered well actually can be a really good housing solution. I think delivered badly it can be a really terrible one, you know. So it's not as polemic as that. But it's that I felt, particularly during COVID, that London had lost its edge a little bit, just lost its interest as a place to be. You know, it wasn't really humming. I don't mean right in the middle of COVID, you know, sort of leading up to and probably just after. It wasn't a particularly interesting place to be, you know. It didn't feel culturally very interesting. It didn't feel economically very interesting. It didn't feel from a design point of view very interesting. You know, if I asked you for your favourite regeneration schemes, I bet you'd have to scratch around a little bit in your head to really determine that was a really good one. You know, you can say, King's Cross, that was good. After that, you're kind of gone. And that shouldn't be the way for a world city. You know, we should have a raft of things to choose from. So I think it's really important that cities don't lose their variety and diversity and ability to reinvent themselves and ability to get a bit crap for a while and then to improve and then to go off in all sorts of different directions. And I feel that that's been absent from policy making for a while. You know, that carefulness around that has been absent from policy making. It's been a bit knee-jerk. It's been a bit, you know what, retail patterns are changing, let's repopulate high streets with housing. You know what, commercial patterns are changing, let's repopulate the commercial spaces with housing. And housing is the one thing that's inflexible, you know, with regards to the way cities need to change. So housing is really important. We need to deliver more of it. My first sort of way to do that would be to deliver all the undelivered planning consents. Someone's going to need to invest in that. It's going to cost a lot. But maybe just invest in delivering those. Give the money that's necessary to deliver those rather than inventing new bits of things that we can develop. Commercial buildings, retail buildings, green belt. You know, they may all be important solutions in the future, but I don't think they're important solutions now as much as delivering the things that we have already got consent for. And then rethink what's important about the city. A lot of my work with London CLT, which is a community-led housing scheme which delivers permanently affordable homes for people who already live there. So the idea is that it maintains the socio-economic mixture of an area, and people who live there or were born there can still continue to live there, and there's these intergenerational impacts of that, and a really wide range of social value improvements as a result of that. That's really important, because that's what gives the place character. You know, the empty shop front that can be used for something else, that gives the place character. The office block that, you know, might end up having a rave there, or there might be this, that and the other. That's really important for a character. And that's why people choose places to live. It's because anything could happen, you know, to a certain extent, especially urban places to live. So for me, as well as all the mixture of things and making sure things function well, and that there's places to work, and we can get to places to work, and there's places to live, and whatever else, there's an element of the unknown that I think it's really important about cities. And we need to try to make sure we don't draw that out when we're creating policies for urban change.
Colin, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And it's really interesting to hear your perspective on such a range of experiences and topics. And really looking forward to seeing what happens next for you and the work you're doing.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.